Chapter 19. The Isms. We've come to the last topic that we're going to discuss relating to the key issues of today. This chapter is all about the isms: communism, socialism, fascism, globalism, nationalism, and capitalism. These are all economic and political systems that are front and center in the news these days. I'm going to start by explaining what each of these are. Let's start with communism. It was first written about by Karl Marx in his Communist Manifesto, published in 1848. The basic principle is that there isn't any private property. Everything is state or government owned and controlled. The government is authoritarian, so there's no constitution in which the leader is responsible to the people, and the power resides in a sole leader. Marx hoped for an eventual withering away of the state so that the people would then own everything. Now, that's never happened, and I'm sure you see the obvious fallacy in that logic. An all-supreme leader isn't going to give up power. These are some of the policies included in the manifesto: transfer of property to public purposes, a high income tax, no rights of inheritance, a centralized national bank controlled by the government, centralized communication and transportation controlled by the government, factories and companies owned by the government establishment of agricultural jobs, and free public education. I'm sure you noticed these policies have a lot of similarities to the Green New Deal. Communism is in direct opposition to capitalism. The Soviet Union was a former communist nation. Today, China, Cuba, Laos, North Korea, and Vietnam all have communist governments. Here's an inconvenient, ugly truth about communism directly quoted from the manifesto. There are, besides eternal truths, such as freedom, justice, etc., that are common to all states of society, but communism abolishes eternal truths. It abolishes all religion and all morality, instead of constituting them on a new basis. It therefore acts in contradiction to all past historical experience. It abolishes eternal truths, all religion, and all morality. You already know that your enemy, Satan, doesn't want people to seek after God, who is the eternal truth. I hope you see communism for what it truly is, one of the devil's wicked schemes. Socialism is a close cousin to communism. Both of them are Marxist ideologies. Communism is in fact a form of socialism. It's a variety of economic and political initiatives that promote government ownership and control of the means of production and distribution of goods. You can think of it as the stage between capitalism and communism. Things like Social Security, universal health care, and free public education are all socialist in nature. Now, let's look at capitalism. This is where the means of production and distribution are privately and corporately owned. The government doesn't own companies, and it's not in the business of making or selling products and services. Businesses operate for profit. A competitive market determines prices and levels of production. The U.S., Canada, Germany, and the United Kingdom are all examples of capitalist countries. Fascism is coming up a lot lately, too. This ideology can be opposed to communism and socialism, or against capitalism and democracy. It essentially places the nation, and often a particular race, above everything else. The government is in the hands of an autocrat, a sole ruler, with unlimited power. Militant nationalism is a key weapon of the government. They use violence to suppress people and the truth. The Nazi regime and Mussolini's rule over Italy were fascist. Today, it's seen in extremist and terrorist groups like the KKK, ISIS, and Antifa. It's interesting that Antifa claims they're anti-fascist, yet they have a logo that's strikingly similar to the 1933 paramilitary wing of the Communist Party of Germany, who also claimed they were anti-fascist. That leaves us with two more isms to discuss: globalism and nationalism. They are polar opposites. Globalism is a one world, one government view. It favors open borders, free trade, and rejects a nation's right to autonomy. Thus, nationalism promotes unity within a nation. It respects national culture, borders, localized government, fair trade, and the right of a nation to be self-governed. A global government is coming one day. It's the government the Antichrist will reign from. Now, consider each of those isms when thinking of important issues today. Freedom of speech would be suppressed in a communist, socialist, and fascist regime because an authoritarian ruler wouldn't have a constitution or Bill of Rights for the people. Just look at what's going on in China today. They can't open up a web browser and search for anything they want. No, their content is censored. They can't freely speak out against the government or a company because they have a social credit system that penalizes them for dissonance. They also can't freely worship Jesus because their government promotes atheism. The people are oppressed, and truth is suppressed. How about universal health care? It sounds nice that everyone gets free health care, but does it really work out for your good when there's a monopoly controlling your health? That's what a single-payer Medicare for All plan would do, create a monopoly. People assume that the monopoly, which would be the government, is going to deliver the best care possible and operate in your best interest. That's a terribly naive and false assumption. It has no economic incentive to do that. In fact, it has the opposite incentive. Let's look at how a country with universal health care has handled the coronavirus outbreak. People infected with coronavirus often need a critical care bed in a hospital. Forbes recently published an article that displays the number of critical care beds per 100,000 people for several countries. The U.S. leads the world with 34.7 critical care beds per 100,000 Americans. Now consider Italy. They have a single-payer universal health care system. They only have 12.5 critical care beds per 100,000 people. You've seen the news reports about what's happening in Italy. Italy doesn't have enough hospitals, beds, or doctors to handle the epidemic, so doctors are having to decide who to treat. Who do you think they're going to treat? They're going to prioritize younger, healthier patients over older and sicker patients. How is this considered a model healthcare system? It's a farce. The politicians advocating this want government control of healthcare so they can decide who lives and dies. Remember that the Green New Deal and UN Agenda 2030 supporters think we're killing the planet and that we have an unsustainable level of consumption. So depopulation is one of the goals in their plan to save the world. Think about education under a communist or socialist government. There would be free public school like we have today in the U.S., but private schools wouldn't exist, and neither would homeschooling. You would no longer have a choice regarding what you or your children learn. Many politicians today are promising free college, free childcare, and free preschool if they're elected. These are all socialist programs. Free always comes with a price. A government that controls what people learn is quite dangerous. It could easily suppress the truth, teach one-sided history, and foster the beliefs the government values. Do you think your children would ever read the Bible and learn about God in a completely socialist education system? Look at what they're teaching in preschool and elementary schools today. States are now requiring students learn LGBTQ+ history. Little children are being told that gender is fluid. The horrifying drag queen story hour has now infiltrated public schools. Remember what you learned above about communism. It abolishes eternal truths, all religion, and all morality. That's what the government would teach. I think it can be hard for people to grasp the impact socialist policies would have on them specifically. So let's apply it to a school environment. That's something we should all be familiar with. Campus Reform interviewed college students and asked if they had a favorable or unfavorable opinion of socialism. In the video, each student supported socialism. The interviewer then explained that socialism is about income equality, wealth distribution, and no personal and private property. The interviewer then asked each student to apply socialism to their GPA. When asked if they'd willingly help a struggling student with a low GPA by giving them some of their own higher GPA, incredibly, they all balked at the idea. They all acknowledged that they worked really hard for their GPA, so why should they have to give it to someone who didn't? You see? They don't really support socialism. They just like the idea of free stuff. Remember that Satan is a thief, and he's behind all the ideologies of taking from people who have and giving it to people who don't. God has a different policy. Remember back to our conversation in the prior chapter regarding whose responsibility it is? God's policy is for each of us to give willingly, not out of reluctance or because we were forced to. 2 Corinthians 9:7. It's because this is one way in which God tests our heart and our faith. There are rewards and treasure in heaven tied to our behavior here on earth. Satan doesn't want you to have any treasure. Revelation 3:11. If he can steal something from you or force you to give something up, then he's successfully ruined an opportunity for you. Now, some people think the Bible supports communism because the early believers lived together, shared what they had, and that Sapphira and Ananias died because they wouldn't share. Acts 2:42-47, 4:32-37, 5:1-11. That's only partially true. No one forced the early Christians to give up their property or live together or share everything. They did it of their own accord and free will. God even illustrates with Sapphira and Ananias that personal property was theirs to sell or not as they wished. Acts 5:4. They died because they lied to the Holy Spirit. They said they sold all of their property, but they didn't. Their hearts weren't right with God. You have to consider what these early Christians did as what you would do for your own family. Are you the kind of person who likes to share with your family and friends what God has blessed you with? That's exactly what they did. You know, when Jesus fed the 5,000 and the 4,000, John 6, Matthew 14-15, he recognized that many people were following him for the wrong reasons. Jesus answered them, "Most certainly I tell you, you seek me not because you saw signs, but because you ate of the loaves and were filled." At this, many of his disciples went back and walked no more with him. John 6:26-66. They just wanted free food. There's a reason Jesus called them out. The Apostle Paul gives us some insight. "For even when we were with you, we commanded you this: if anyone is not willing to work, don't let him eat. For we hear of some who walk among you in rebellion, who don't work at all, but are busybodies. Now those who are that way, we command and exhort in the Lord Jesus Christ, that they work with quietness and eat their own bread." 2 Thessalonians 3:10-12. Paul tells us that people refusing to work are walking in rebellion. We're rebelling when we're not obeying God. God has given each of us skills and talents, and he expects each of us to use what he's given us. When we do, it rewards us and brings God glory. Matthew 5:16, Colossians 3:23-24. People who refuse to obey and refuse to work are robbing God of the glory he deserves. 1 Corinthians 3:13-15. Jesus communicated this truth in the parable of the talents, or minas. Matthew 25:14-30, Luke 19:11-27. A parable depicts life in heaven. This particular parable illustrates that God's kingdom isn't communist or socialist. People aren't treated equally in heaven. In the parable, the master went away and left his servants in charge. That's like Jesus going away and leaving us in charge. He gave each one a portion of talents in proportion to their own ability and told them to invest it while he was gone. One got 5 talents, another 3 talents, and the last got 1 talent. Each servant doubled what they were given, except the servant who only got 1 talent. He buried his talent instead. When the master returned, he called that servant wicked and lazy. Matthew 25:26. Then Jesus said this. He said to those who stood by, "Take the mina away from him and give it to him who has the 10 minas." They said to him, Lord, he has 10 minas. For I tell you that to everyone who has will more be given, but from him who doesn't have, even that which he has will be taken away from him. Luke 19:24-26. The Master, Jesus, took his 1 talent and gave it to the servant who already had 10. He didn't give it to the person who only had 3. Instead, he gave it to the person who already had the most. Jesus rewards those who work the hardest and have the most to show for it. Those are the people who are bringing him the most glory. There's another big reason God doesn't support socialist governments. He wants each of us to depend upon him and not something or someone else. He's the God who provides. Matthew 6:25-33, Philippians 4:19. There's an excellent illustration of this in the Bible. It's the account of the Israelites and their enslavement in Egypt, Genesis 41-47. Now, they didn't start out as slaves. They weren't even conquered and taken into slavery. No, they willingly sold themselves into slavery. It all started when the Egyptian Pharaoh had a dream, and Joseph, an Israelite, was brought in to interpret it. God told Joseph that Pharaoh's dream was about a severe drought and famine that was coming. There would be 7 years of prosperity followed by 7 years of famine. Pharaoh adopted Joseph's plan and had him collect 1/5 of all the crops during the good years. Then they'd be able to sell it to the people during the famine years. What do you think happened in the famine years when the people's money ran out? They sold their livestock and their land. Genesis 47:13-20. When they had nothing left to sell, they sold themselves. Genesis 47:21-24. So Pharaoh had all the money, all the land, and everyone worked for Pharaoh. Uh-oh. As soon as Joseph and that Pharaoh died, a different Pharaoh came into power who treated the Israelites harshly and forced them to make bricks and work in the fields. Do you think history would have been the same if the people started out by saving grain themselves instead of depending on Pharaoh? After God rescued the Israelites from their bondage, recall that God gave them manna to eat every day, Exodus 16. They had to go out each day and harvest it. On day 6, they gathered enough for 2 days, because day 7 was the Sabbath, when they rested. Do you remember what happened to the people who gathered more than they needed on days 1-5? It was full of maggots and smelled. Ew. God was teaching them to depend upon Him, to trust that He'd be faithful to provide for them each day. They'd grown accustomed to depending upon a ruler to provide for them. They needed to be broken of that habit. Another principle that God taught those Israelites after He rescued them is that debt is a bad thing. Don't be fooled by what your financial advisor, tax accountant, or anyone else tells you about all the benefits of debt. That's the worldly way of viewing it. If you're a believer, you're a citizen of heaven, and thus you don't think or behave like the world. Debt leads to slavery. It's a hard lesson the Israelites had to learn. It was for our benefit, though. In a socialist and communist government, the people are essentially indebted to the government because the government provides everything for the people. That's exactly what happened to the Israelites in Egypt. Pharaoh rescued them from poverty and gave them food and jobs, but then he made them slaves. When God gave the Israelites the law, He gave them commands about debt and slavery. Every 7 years they were to forgive the debts of fellow Israelites who owed them money. Deuteronomy 15:1-4. It was God's time of release. A similar law applied to land and any Israelites who had sold themselves into slavery. Every 50th year, land returned to its rightful owner, and Israelite slaves were freed. Leviticus 25. God commanded that they not take advantage of each other. You see, that's our nature and God knows it. We'll take advantage. That's exactly what a socialist or communist government will do too. Pharaoh proved it. Mao Zedong, Joseph Stalin, Fidel Castro, Kim Il-sung, Ho Chi Minh, Pol Pot, and Adolf Hitler have all proved it. So let's see where the political parties and 2020 presidential candidates stand on the isms. In Chapter 17, Climate Change, you learned that the Democrat Party and the Green Party both support the Green New Deal, which is a communist economic policy. The Libertarians and Republicans are against it. The Libertarian Party supports a free and competitive market economy and believes the government should protect property rights. They oppose any redistribution of wealth. However, they do support free trade, which is a form of globalism. Let's continue understanding Bernie's policies, since he's influencing Biden's platform. Bernie Sanders supports Medicare for All, which is a single-payer national health care program that'll provide everyone free coverage. He also supports tuition-free college, canceling student loan debt, building 10 million housing units for the homeless, free childcare, free preschool, and a federal jobs guarantee. He believes the government should set the quality standards for childcare and preschool programs. He also wants to ban for-profit charter schools. He also wants to expand Buy American and Buy Local policies. His website certainly lists a lot of things he plans to provide the people for free. There's one thing I noticed that's missing, though: national defense. I didn't see anything that spoke to what he'd do to protect our country and how he'd support our military. Joe Biden wants to provide 2 years of community college or the equivalent debt-free. However, he also supports tuition-free college for families with incomes below $125,000. He wants to bring back Obamacare and build upon the Affordable Care Act. Like Sanders, he also supports free preschool. He wants to give people $15,000 to buy their first home and plans to develop a strategy to make housing a right for everyone. He does have a good statement about the military. We have the strongest military in the world, and as president, Biden will ensure it stays that way. Also, remember that Sanders and Biden both support the Green New Deal and all of the socialist policies that go with it. Now, President Trump favors capitalism, nationalism, strong borders, fair trade, a prepared military, low taxes, and less regulations for businesses. He renegotiated the NAFTA trade deal with Mexico and Canada. The new agreement is the USMCA, which created 176,000 jobs and $68 billion in economic activity. He withdrew the U.S. from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He's been building a wall along our southern border and expects to have 450 miles completed by the end of 2020. As for health care, he repealed the Obamacare mandate, expanded access to association health plans so small businesses can pool risk across states, and he allowed short-term, limited-duration plans to be extended up to 12 months. He rebuilt the military and has provided $1.5 trillion to the Defense Department. He also created a new branch of the military, the United States Space Force. In the education space, he expanded federally funded apprenticeship programs and on-the-job training. Congress passed historic tax cuts, which doubled the child tax credit, almost doubled the standard deduction, and reduced small business taxes by 20%. Prior to the coronavirus outbreak, the economy gained 6 million new jobs, and the unemployment rate was its lowest in 50 years. The coronavirus has certainly had a huge impact on economic policy, hasn't it? Not just in the U.S., but all across the globe. President Trump recently signed the CARES Act, which provides $2 trillion in relief to Americans and businesses. Congress is still working on additional relief bills. When all is said and done, trillions upon trillions will have been doled out by governments across the world. There is good intent behind the relief. However, it harkens back to a prior time and to a prior warning. Is this a temporary firefight, or did we just take one giant leap toward socialism on a global scale? There's an evil scheme that political parties and candidates who support socialism and communism subscribe to. It's called the Cloward-Piven strategy. It calls for overloading the welfare system in order to spark a crisis that would lead to that system being replaced with a universal income. The steps to create the social state thereafter include universal health care, high poverty, unsustainable debt, high taxes, gun control, universal education, pitting the poor against the wealthy, and removing religion. Many of these things are happening today, aren't they? But here's the thing. We didn't choose the coronavirus. No one elected it. It's a reminder that God is in control. He's allowed this to happen. There's a reason the Marxist ideologies of communism and socialism are front and center today. The election Omen holds the key to understanding. Throughout all the other chapters, you've learned that a nation will advance in wickedness until it reaches the polar opposite of God. I've shown we've reached that point when looking at several issues. Then when a nation turns completely away from God and reaches the point of no return, it will bring judgment upon itself. Once again, we've arrived at this point too. We're at the point in which God gives a nation the ruler they desire. That's exactly what's happening right now. We're getting what we, as a global society, have asked for. For the first time ever, most of the world's population is dissatisfied with democracy. 57.5% of citizens globally. The U.S. has seen the most pronounced increase, from 25% being dissatisfied during post-war decades to 55% dissatisfied today. God is preparing the way for the Antichrist. That's the ruler that the world wants. The Bible tells us that he will be so well-liked that people worship him. He's going to establish the one-world communist-style government we've talked about, Revelation 13. The global state of affairs due to the coronavirus is a foreshadow of what's to come. In this truly dark hour, for not just our nation but the globe, your voice matters. Your vote matters. We don't know when Jesus is coming to rapture his believers. It could happen any minute, any day, or even years from now. Don't vote for the Democrat candidates who desire an Antichrist-like economy. You must vote for the state and local candidates who will protect your constitutional rights, your freedom, and who will not take advantage of the situation we're in with the coronavirus and the liberties we've all given up. President Trump wants us and our economy to get back to work. He sees our present situation as temporary. Let your light shine during this dark time, and hope that it brings people to God. In the long history of the world, only a few generations have been granted the role of defending freedom in its hour of maximum danger. I do not shrink from this responsibility. I welcome it. I do not believe that any of us would exchange places with any other people or any other generation. The energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it, and the glow from that fire can truly light the world. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. My fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man. Finally, whether you are citizens of America or citizens of the world, ask of us here the same high standards of strength and sacrifice which we ask of you, with a good conscience, our only sure reward with history, the final judge of our deeds. Let us go forth to lead the land we love, asking His blessing and His help, but knowing that here on earth God's work must truly be our own. President John F. Kennedy's inaugural address, 1961.